You wake up craving cocaine in New York or crossing the Arizona desert on a 100-degree afternoon. That white powder in the line began its journey more than 1,500 miles south, grown in a jungle clearing controlled by armed men most of the world will never see. This is how it actually gets from there to here, not the movie version. The real supply chain, start to finish, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why an industry law enforcement has fought for 50 years, still moves product with almost mechanical reliability. It starts in the fields, mostly in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia for cocaine, though the exact regions shift as enforcement pressure moves from one area to another. Coca leaves are harvested by farmers who are, more often than not, simply trying to survive economically in regions where legal crops don't pay the bills, where roads barely exist, and where the nearest legal market might be a full day's travel away. For many of these farming communities, coca isn't a moral choice. It's the only crop that reliably sells at a price that covers the cost of growing it. The leaves are processed into a paste locally, in small hidden labs, long before it ever resembles the finished product people eventually buy. This first processing stage is deliberately kept close to the fields because raw leaf is bulky and low value. Turning it into paste immediately concentrates the product into something worth transporting. From there, it moves to larger processing labs, often deep in remote jungle territory specifically because the terrain makes them nearly impossible for authorities to locate by air or ground. These labs refine the paste into the pure product, and this is where cartel control tightens. Smaller local producers sell up the chain to organizations with the money, weapons, and connections to move it internationally. The chemists running these labs are often specialists, paid significantly more than average local wages because the purity and consistency of the final product directly determines its value at every later stage of the chain. Getting the product out of the producing country is stage one of the actual smuggling operation, and it already involves a surprising amount of infrastructure. Small aircraft make short unregistered flights over dense jungle, landing on hidden airstrips carved out of remote farmland, often nothing more than a flattened stretch of dirt, only usable for a handful of flights before it's abandoned entirely. Some loads move by river, hidden inside legitimate cargo boats making their normal trade routes, blending in with the ordinary commercial traffic that moves through the same waterways every single day. This stage relies heavily on local knowledge. Pilots and boat captains who know exactly which patrol patterns to avoid and when, often because they've made the same run dozens of times before. Once product reaches a transit country, often somewhere in Central America or the Caribbean, the smuggling method diversifies dramatically because putting an entire shipment through one method is too risky. This is where the operation starts looking less like a criminal gang and more like a logistics company managing multiple shipping channels at once, deliberately spreading risk the same way any large shipping business would diversify across carriers. Maritime routes carry an enormous share of the total volume. Go-fast boats, small, low-profile speedboats with powerful engines, make short, high-speed runs along coastlines, timed around patrol schedules and often running only at night, using minimal lighting to avoid visual detection. For larger loads, cartels have used semi-submersible vessels, low-riding boats built specifically to sit almost entirely underwater, showing barely more than a small hatch above the surface, making them extremely difficult for radar or aircraft to spot. Building one of these vessels can take a dedicated crew of engineers weeks, working in hidden jungle boatyards specifically to support a handful of high-value runs. Container shipping is arguably the biggest single channel by volume, simply because of scale. Global shipping ports process an overwhelming number of containers daily, and it's mathematically impossible to physically inspect more than a small percentage of them. Product gets hidden inside legitimate cargo, packed into produce shipments, machinery, or building materials, sometimes with the knowledge of a bribed employee somewhere in the supply chain, sometimes without anyone in the legal business even aware their shipment was used. In some documented cases, product has been sealed inside the walls of shipping containers themselves, or mixed directly into legitimate goods like canned food or industrial chemicals, specifically engineered to defeat both physical inspection and scent detection methods. Human couriers still move a meaningful amount of product, especially across land borders, though this method carries the highest personal risk to the individual involved. Vehicles get modified with hidden compartments built into gas tanks, door panels, and undercarriages, professional builds that can take hours of skilled labor and are specifically designed to defeat standard vehicle searches, sometimes even X-ray scanning at official checkpoints. Some couriers carry product internally, a method associated with extremely serious health risk, used almost exclusively by lower-level operators who are, frankly, considered expendable within the organization's structure. These individuals are typically paid a small fraction of the shipment's actual value, take on nearly all of the legal risk, and are the ones most likely to actually be caught and prosecuted, while the organizers further up the chain remain insulated. Tunnels represent one of the most resource-intensive smuggling methods, used specifically at high-traffic land border points, where cross-border movement is otherwise heavily monitored. Some discovered tunnels have stretched hundreds of meters, complete with lighting, ventilation systems, and rail carts for moving product efficiently between entry and exit points. These aren't dug by amateurs. Engineering expertise gets brought in specifically for this purpose, sometimes borrowing techniques from legitimate mining operations, and a single tunnel can represent months of construction investment before a single shipment ever moves through it. Authorities that discover these tunnels often find they were built to last, reinforced and maintained like genuine infrastructure rather than a one-time smuggling trick. None of this actually works, though, without corruption at multiple points along the chain. Bribery isn't a side effect of trafficking, it's core infrastructure. Border officials, port workers, and in some documented cases, higher-level officials, get paid to look away at specific moments, delay inspections, or misdirect resources during a shipment window. Organizations budget for this the same way a legitimate business budgets for shipping costs. It's simply the price of moving product safely. In regions with weaker institutional oversight, this corruption can extend surprisingly high, sometimes reaching officials responsible for the very units meant to stop trafficking in the first place. Once product crosses into the destination country, the distribution network shifts structure entirely. Large shipments get broken down at regional distribution hubs into smaller loads, then broken down again and again, moving through multiple layers of increasingly local distributors before reaching street level. This layering exists specifically to protect the organization. The people at the top of the supply chain rarely have any direct contact with street-level sales, which makes prosecuting the actual leadership extremely difficult even when lower-level arrests happen regularly. Each layer typically only knows the layer directly above and below it, so even a cooperating witness usually can't expose more than a small slice of the overall network. It's worth noting that not every drug moves through this exact system. Methamphetamine and fentanyl, for example, are synthetic, meaning they don't require agricultural cultivation at all, just chemical precursors, which shifts the entire supply chain toward chemical importation and lab production rather than crop farming. This has made synthetic drugs significantly harder to interdict at the source, since the precursor chemicals often have legitimate industrial uses and can be sourced from multiple countries, making the starting point of the chain far more diffuse and difficult to trace back to a single origin. And then there's the part that closes the loop. The money has to travel back. Cash generated from street sales gets laundered through an equally complex system. Legitimate-seeming businesses that report far more revenue than they realistically generate. Real estate purchases in stable markets, and increasingly, cryptocurrency transactions that add another layer of difficulty for financial investigators to trace across borders. This money eventually flows back to fund the next production cycle, pay the network of bribes that keeps the whole chain moving, and support the armed enforcement that protects territory and product along the way. In many producing regions, this same money also funds local infrastructure and employment that the legitimate economy has failed to provide, which is part of why these organizations can maintain community support, or at least tolerance in the areas where they operate. What makes this system so resilient isn't any single method, it's the redundancy. If one smuggling route gets shut down, shipments simply shift to another. If one transit country tightens enforcement, the network reroutes through a neighboring one. Law enforcement operations regularly succeed at intercepting individual shipments, seizing tunnels, and arresting couriers, and the overall flow barely slows because the system was built from the start to absorb exactly this kind of loss. Seizure statistics that sound enormous in isolation often represent only a small percentage of total estimated production in a given year. This is also why the human cost of this industry extends so far beyond the people who actually use the final product. Farming communities remain economically dependent on a crop that keeps them in a legal gray area. Transit countries absorb the violence of competing organizations fighting over control of smuggling corridors. Border regions see the heaviest enforcement presence, and the couriers and low-level operators, the most replaceable, least protected people in the entire chain, carry almost all of the direct legal risk while receiving the smallest share of the profit. This is why, despite billions of dollars spent on interdiction efforts over decades, the fundamental structure of the trade has proven remarkably difficult to dismantle. It isn't one criminal act. It's a global supply chain, built with the same logistical thinking as any major international shipping operation, deliberately engineered for redundancy at every stage, just running in the shadows, insulated at the top and absorbing losses at the bottom as simply the cost of doing business. If you want to see how law enforcement actually tries to dismantle a network like this, from the bottom up to the top, and why it's so difficult to make it stick, let me know in the comments.